Chapter 46 of the Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 46. Unlimited Credit. About 2 o'clock the following day, a calash drawn by a pair of magnificent English horses stopped at the door of Monte Cristo, and a person dressed in a blue coat with buttons of a similar colour, a white waistcoat over which was displayed a massive gold chain, brown trousers, and a quantity of black hair descending so low over his eyebrows as to leave it doubtful whether it were not artificial, so little did its jetty glossiness assimilate with the deep wrinkles stamped on his features. A person, in a word, who, although evidently past 50, desired to be taken for not more than 40, bent forwards from the carriage door, on the panels of which were emblazoned the armorial bearings of a baron, and directed his groom to inquire at the porter's lodge whether the Count of Monte Cristo resided there, and if he were within. While waiting, the occupant of the carriage surveyed the house, the garden as far as he could distinguish it, and the livery of servants who passed to and fro with an attention so close as to be somewhat impertinent. His glance was keen, but showed cunning rather than intelligence. His lips were straight and so thin that as they closed they were drawn in over the teeth. His cheekbones were broad and projecting, a never-failing proof of audacity and craftiness, while the flatness of his forehead and the enlargement of the back of his skull, which rose much higher than his large and coarsely shaped ears, combined to form a physiognomy anything but prepossessing. Save in the eyes of such as considered that the owner of so splendid an equipage must needs be all that was admirable and enviable, more especially when they gazed on the enormous diamond that glittered in his shirt and the red ribbon that depended from his buttonhole. The groom, in obedience to his orders, tapped at the window of the porter's lodge, saying, "Pray, does not the Count of Monte Cristo live here?" "His Excellency does reside here," replied the concierge. "But," added he, glancing an inquiring look at Ali. Ali returned a sign in the negative. "But what?" asked the groom. "His Excellency does not receive visitors today." "Then here is my master's card, the Baron Danglars. You will take it to the count and say that, although in haste to attend the chamber, my master came out of his way to have the honor of calling upon him." "I never speak to his Excellency," replied the concierge. "The valet de chambre will carry your message." The groom returned to the carriage. "Well?" asked Danglars. The man, somewhat crestfallen by the rebuke he had received, repeated what the concierge had said. "Bless me," murmured Baron Danglars, "this must surely be a prince instead of a count by their styling him Excellency, and only venturing to address him by the medium of his valet de chambre. However, it does not signify. He has a letter of credit on me, so I must see him when he requires his money." Then, throwing himself back in his carriage, Danglars called out to his coachman in a voice that might be heard across the road, "To the Chamber of Deputies." Apprised in time of the visit paid him, Monte Cristo had from behind the blinds of his pavilion, as minutely observed the baron, by means of an excellent lorgnette, as Danglars himself had scrutinized the house, garden, and servants. "That fellow has a decidedly bad countenance," said the count in a tone of disgust, as he shut up his glass into its ivory case. "How comes it that all do not retreat in aversion at sight of that flat receding serpent-like forehead, round vulture-shaped head, and sharp hooked nose like the beak of a buzzard?" "Ali!" cried he, striking at the same time on the brazen gong. Ali appeared. "Summon Bertuccio," said the count. Almost immediately Bertuccio entered the apartment. "Did your Excellency desire to see me?" inquired he. "I did," replied the count. "You no doubt observed the horses standing a few minutes since at the door?" "Certainly, your Excellency. I noticed them for their remarkable beauty." "Then how comes it," said Monte Cristo with a frown, that when I desired you to purchase for me the finest pair of horses to be found in Paris, there is another pair fully as fine as mine, not in my stables." At the look of displeasure added to the angry tone in which the count spoke, Ali turned pale and held down his head. "It is not your fault, my good Ali," said the count in the Arabic language, and with a gentleness none would have thought him capable of, showing either in voice or face. "It is not your fault. You do not understand the points of English horses." The countenance of poor Ali recovered its serenity. "Permit me to assure your Excellency," said Bertuccio, "that the horses you speak of were not to be sold when I purchased yours." Monte Cristo shrugged his shoulders. "It seems, Sir Steward," said he, "that you have yet to learn that all things are to be sold to such as care to pay the price. His Excellency is not perhaps aware that M. Danglars gave 16,000 francs for his horses." "Very well, then offer him double that sum. A banker never loses an opportunity of doubling his capital." "Is your Excellency really in earnest?" inquired the steward. Monte Cristo regarded the person who durst presume to doubt his words with the look of one equally surprised and displeased. "I have to pay a visit this evening," replied he. "I desire that these horses, with completely new harnesses, may be at the door with my carriage." Bertuccio bowed and was to retire, but when he reached the door he paused, and then said, "At what o'clock does your Excellency wish the carriage and horses to be ready?" "At 5 o'clock," replied the count. "I beg your Excellency's pardon," interposed the steward in a deprecating manner, "for venturing to observe that it is already 2 o'clock." "I am perfectly aware of that fact," answered Monte Cristo calmly. Then turning towards Ali, he said, "Let all the horses in my stables be led before the windows of your young lady, that she may select those she prefers for her carriage. Request her also to oblige me by saying whether it is her pleasure to dine with me. If so, let dinner be served in her apartments. Now leave me, and desire my valet de chambre to come hither." Scarcely had Ali disappeared when the valet entered the chamber. "Monsieur Baptistin," said the count, "you have been in my service 1 year, the time I generally give myself to judge of the merits or demerits of those about me. You suit me very well." Baptistin bowed low. "It only remains for me to know whether I also suit you." "Oh, your Excellency!" exclaimed Baptistin eagerly. "Listen, if you please, till I have finished speaking," replied Monte Cristo. "You receive 1,500 francs per annum for your services here, more than many a brave subaltern who continually risks his life for his country obtains. You live in a manner far superior to many clerks who work 10 times harder than you do for their money. Then, though yourself a servant, you have other servants to wait upon you, take care of your clothes, and see that your linen is duly prepared for you. Again, you make a profit upon each article you purchase for my toilet, amounting in the course of a year to a sum equaling your wages." "Nay, indeed, your Excellency, I am not condemning you for this, Monsieur Baptistin, but let your profits end here. It would be long indeed ere you would find so lucrative a post as that you have now the good fortune to fill. I neither ill use nor ill treat my servants by word or action. An error I readily forgive, but wilful negligence or forgetfulness, never. My commands are ordinarily short, clear, and precise, and I would rather be obliged to repeat my words twice or even 3 times than they should be misunderstood. I am rich enough to know whatever I desire to know, and I can promise you I am not wanting in curiosity. If then I should learn that you had taken upon yourself to speak of me to anyone favourably or unfavourably, to comment on my actions or watch my conduct, that very instant you would quit my service. You may now retire. I never caution my servants a second time. Remember that." Baptistin bowed and was proceeding towards the door. "I forgot to mention to you," said the count, "that I lay yearly aside a certain sum for each servant in my establishment. Those who I am compelled to dismiss lose, as a matter of course, all participation in this money, while their portion goes to the fund accumulating for those domestics who remain with me, and among whom it will be divided at my death. You have been in my service a year. Your fund has already begun to accumulate. Let it continue to do so." This address, delivered in the presence of Ali, who was not understanding one word of the language in which it was spoken, stood wholly unmoved, produced an effect on M. Baptistin only to be conceived by such as have occasion to study the character and disposition of French domestics. "I assure your Excellency," said he, "that at least it shall be my study to merit your approbation in all things, and I will take M. Ali as my model." "By no means," replied the count in the most frigid tones. "Ali has many faults mixed with most excellent qualities. He cannot possibly serve you as a pattern for your conduct, not being, as you are, a paid servant, but a mere slave, a dog, who, should he fail in his duty towards me, I should not discharge from my service, but kill." Baptistin opened his eyes with astonishment. "You seem incredulous," said Monte Cristo, who repeated to Ali in the Arabic language what he had just been saying to Baptistin in French. The Nubian smiled assentingly to his master's words, then, kneeling on one knee, respectfully kissed the hand of the count. This corroboration of the lesson he had just received put the finishing stroke to the wonder and stupefaction of M. Baptistin. The count then motioned the valet de chambre to retire, and to Ali to follow to his study, where they conversed long and earnestly together. As the hand of the clock pointed to 5, the count struck thrice upon his gong. When Ali was wanted, 1 stroke was given, 2 summoned Baptistin, and 3 Bertuccio. The steward entered. "My horses," said Monte Cristo. "They are at the door, harnessed to the carriage, as your Excellency desired." "Does your Excellency wish me to accompany him?" "No, the coachman, Ali, and Baptistin will go." The count descended to the door of his mansion, and beheld his carriage drawn by the very pair of horses he had so much admired in the morning as the property of Danglars. As he passed them, he said, "They are extremely handsome. Certainly you have done well to purchase them, although you were somewhat remiss not to have procured them sooner." "Indeed, your Excellency, I had very considerable difficulty in obtaining them, and as it is, they have cost an enormous price." "Does the sum you gave for them make the animals less beautiful?" inquired the count, shrugging his shoulders. "Nay, if your Excellency is satisfied, it is all that I could wish. Whither does your Excellency desire to be driven?" "To the residence of Baron Danglars, Rue de la Chaussée d'Antin." This conversation had passed as they stood upon the terrace, from which a flight of stone steps led to the carriage drive. As Bertuccio, with a respectful bow, was moving away, the count called him back. "I have another commission for you, Monsieur Bertuccio," said he. "I am desirous of having an estate by the seaside in Normandy, for instance, between Havre and Boulogne. You see, I give you a wide range. It will be absolutely necessary that the place you may select have a small harbour, creek, or bay into which my corvette can enter and remain at anchor. She draws only 15 feet. She must be kept in constant readiness to sail immediately I think proper to give the signal. Make the requisite inquiries for a place of this description, and when you have met with an eligible spot, visit it, and if it possess the advantages desired, purchase it at once in your own name. The corvette must now, I think, be on her way to Fécamp, must she not?" "Certainly, your Excellency. I saw her put to sea the same evening we quitted Marseilles, and the yacht was ordered to remain at Martigues." "'Tis well. I wish you to write from time to time to the captains in charge of the 2 vessels, so as to keep them on the alert." "And the steamboat?" "She is at Chalons." "Yes, the same orders for her as the 2 sailing vessels. Very good. When you have purchased the estate I desire, I want constant relays of horses at 10 leagues apart along the northern and southern road." "Your Excellency may depend upon me." The count made a gesture of satisfaction, descended the terrace steps, and sprang into his carriage, which was whirled along swiftly to the banker's house. Danglars was engaged at that moment presiding over a railroad committee, but the meeting was nearly concluded when the name of his visitor was announced. As the count's title sounded on his ear, he rose, and addressing his colleagues, who were members of one or the other chamber, he said, "Gentlemen, pardon me for leaving you so abruptly, but a most ridiculous circumstance has occurred, which is this. Thomson and French, the Roman bankers, have sent to me a certain person calling himself the Count of Monte Cristo, and I have given him an unlimited credit with me. I confess this is the drollest thing I have ever met with in the course of my extensive foreign transactions, and you may readily suppose it has greatly roused my curiosity. I took the trouble this morning to call upon the pretended count. If he were a real count, he wouldn't be so rich. But would you believe it? He was not receiving. So the master of Monte Cristo gives himself airs befitting a great millionaire or a capricious beauty. I made inquiries and found that the house in the Champs-Élysées is his own property, and certainly it was very decently kept up. But," pursued Danglars with one of his sinister smiles, "an order for unlimited credit calls for something like caution on the part of the banker to whom that order is given. I am very anxious to see this man. I suspect a hoax is intended, but the instigators of it little knew whom they had to deal with. They laugh best who laugh last." Having delivered himself of this pompous address, uttered with a degree of energy that left the baron almost out of breath, he bowed to the assembled party and withdrew to his drawing-room, whose sumptuous furnishings of white and gold had caused a great sensation in the Chaussée d'Antin. It was to this apartment he had desired his guest to be shown, with the purpose of overwhelming him at the sight of so much luxury. He found the count standing before some copies of Albano and Fattori that had been passed off to the banker as originals, but which, mere copies as they were, seemed to feel their degradation in being brought into juxtaposition with the gaudy colours that covered the ceiling. The count turned round as he heard the entrance of Danglars into the room. With a slight inclination of the head, Danglars signed to the count to be seated, pointing significantly to a gilded armchair, covered with white satin embroidered with gold. The count sat down. "I have the honour, I presume, of addressing Monsieur de Monte Cristo." The count bowed. "And I of speaking to Baron Danglars, Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, and member of the Chamber of Deputies." Monte Cristo repeated all the titles he had read on the baron's card. Danglars felt the irony and compressed his lips. "You will, I trust, excuse me, monsieur, for not calling you by your title when I first addressed you," he said, "but you are aware that we are living under a popular form of government, and that I am myself a representative of the liberties of the people." "So much so," replied Monte Cristo, "that while you call yourself baron, you are not willing to call anybody else count." "Upon my word, monsieur," said Danglars with affected carelessness, "I attach no sort of value to such empty distinctions, but the fact is I was made baron and also Chevalier of the Legion of Honor in return for services rendered, but you have discarded your titles after the example set by Messieurs de Montmorency and Lafayette. That was a noble example to follow, monsieur." "Why," replied Danglars, "not entirely so. With the servants you understand." "I see, to your domestics you are my lord. The journalists style you monsieur, while your constituents call you citizen. These are distinctions very suitable under a constitutional government. I understand perfectly." Again Danglars bit his lips. He saw that he was no match for Monte Cristo in an argument of this sort, and he therefore hastened to turn to subjects more congenial. "Permit me to inform you, count," said he, bowing, "that I have received a letter of advice from Thomson and French of Rome." "I am glad to hear it, baron, for I must claim the privilege of addressing you after the manner of your servants." I have acquired the bad habit of calling persons by their titles when living in a country where barons are still barons by right of birth. But as regards the letter of advice, I am charmed to find that it has reached you. That will spare me the troublesome and disagreeable task of coming to you for money myself. You have received a regular letter of advice?" "Yes," said Danglars, "but I confess I didn't quite comprehend its meaning." "Indeed, and for that reason I did myself the honour of calling upon you in order to beg for an explanation." "Go on, monsieur, here I am, ready to give you any explanation you desire." "Why," said Danglars, "in the letter, I believe I have it about me." Here he felt in his breast pocket. "Yes, here it is. Well, this letter gives the Count of Monte Cristo unlimited credit on our house." "Well, baron, what is there difficult to understand about that?" "Merely the term unlimited, nothing else, certainly." "Is not that word known in France? The people who wrote are Anglo-Germans, you know." "Oh, as for the composition of the letter, there is nothing to be said, but as regards the competency of the document, I certainly have doubts." "Is it possible," asked the count, assuming all air and tone of the utmost simplicity and candour, "is it possible that Thomson and French are not looked upon as safe and solvent bankers? Pray tell me what you think, baron, for I feel uneasy, I can assure you, having some considerable property in their hands." "Thomson and French are perfectly solvent," replied Danglars with an almost mocking smile, "but the word unlimited in financial affairs is so extremely vague." "Is in fact unlimited," said Monte Cristo. "Precisely what I was about to say," cried Danglars. "Now, what is vague is doubtful, and it was a wise man who said, 'When in doubt, keep out.'" "Meaning to say," rejoined Monte Cristo, "that however Thomson and French may be inclined to commit acts of imprudence and folly, the Baron Danglars is not disposed to follow their example." "Not at all, plainly enough. Messieurs Thomson and French set no bounds to their engagements, while those of Monsieur Danglars have their limits. He is a wise man, according to his own showing." "Monsieur," replied the banker, drawing himself up with a haughty air, "the extent of my resources has never yet been questioned." "It seems, then, reserved for me," said Monte Cristo coldly, "to be the first to do so." "By what right, sir?" "By right of the objections you have raised and the explanations you have demanded, which certainly must have some motive." Once more Danglars bit his lips. It was the second time he had been worsted, and this time on his own ground. His forced politeness sat awkwardly upon him, and approached almost to impertinence. Monte Cristo, on the contrary, preserved a graceful suavity of demeanour, aided by a certain degree of simplicity he could assume at pleasure, and thus possessed the advantage. "Very well, sir," resumed Danglars after a brief silence, "I will endeavour to make myself understood by requesting you to inform me for what sum you propose to draw upon me." "Why, truly," replied Monte Cristo, determined not to lose an inch of the ground he had gained, "my reason for desiring an unlimited credit was precisely because I did not know how much money I might need." The banker thought the time had come for him to take the upper hand, so throwing himself back in his armchair, he said with an arrogant and purse-proud air, "Let me beg of you not to hesitate in naming your wishes. You will then be convinced that the resources of the house of Danglars, however limited, are still equal to meeting the largest demands, and were you to even require 1,000,000—" "I beg your pardon," interposed Monte Cristo. "I said 1,000,000," replied Danglars, with the confidence of ignorance. "But could I do with 1,000,000?" retorted the count. "My dear sir, if a trifle like that could suffice me, I should never have given myself the trouble of opening an account. 1,000,000! Excuse my smiling when you speak of a sum I am in the habit of carrying in my pocket-book or dressing-case." And with these words Monte Cristo took from his pocket a small case containing his visiting cards, and drew forth 2 orders on the treasury for 500,000 francs each, payable at sight to the bearer. A man like Danglars was wholly inaccessible to any gentler method of correction. The effect of the present revelation was stunning. He trembled and was on the verge of apoplexy. The pupils of his eyes, as he gazed at Monte Cristo, dilated horribly. "Come, come," said Monte Cristo, "confess honestly that you have not perfect confidence in Thomson and French. I understand, and foreseeing that such might be the case, I took, in spite of my ignorance of affairs, certain precautions. See, here are two similar letters to you that you have yourself received, one from the house of Arstein and Achilles of Vienna to Baron Rothschild, the other drawn by Baring of London upon Monsieur Lafitte. Now, sir, you have but to say the word, and I will spare you all uneasiness by presenting my letter of credit to one or other of these two firms." The blow had struck home, and Danglars was entirely vanquished. With a trembling hand he took the two letters from the count, who held them carelessly between finger and thumb, and proceeded to scrutinize the signatures with a minuteness that the count might have regarded as insulting, had it not suited his present purpose to mislead the banker. "Oh, sir," said Danglars, after he had convinced himself of the authenticity of the documents he held, and rising as if to salute the power of gold personified in the man before him, "3 letters of unlimited credit. I can be no longer mistrustful, but you must pardon me, my dear count, for confessing to some degree of astonishment." "Nay," answered Monte Cristo with the most gentlemanly air, "'tis not for such trifling sums as these that your banking house is to be incommoded. Then you can let me have some money, can you not?" "Whatever you say, my dear count, I am at your orders." "Why," replied Monte Cristo, "since we mutually understand each other, for such I presume is the case." Danglars bowed assentingly. "You are quite sure that not a lurking doubt or suspicion lingers in your mind?" "Oh, my dear count," exclaimed Danglars, "I never for an instant entertained such a feeling towards you." "No, you merely wish to be convinced, nothing more. But now that we have come to so clear an understanding, and all that distrust and suspicion are laid at rest, we may as well fix a sum as the probable expenditure of the first year. Suppose we say 6 millions to—" "6 millions!" gasped Danglars. "So be it." "Then if I should require more," continued Monte Cristo in a careless manner, "why, of course, I should draw upon you. But my present intention is not to remain in France more than a year, and during that period I scarcely think I shall exceed the sum I mentioned. However, we shall see. Be kind enough, then, to send me 500,000 francs tomorrow. I shall be at home till midday, or if not, I will leave a receipt with my steward. The money you desire shall be at your house by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, my dear count," replied Danglars. "How would you like to have it, in gold, silver, or notes?" "Half in gold, and the other half in banknotes, if you please," said the count, rising from his seat. "I must confess to you, count," said Danglars, "that I have hitherto imagined myself acquainted with the degree of all the great fortunes of Europe, and still wealth such as yours has been wholly unknown to me. May I presume to ask whether you have long possessed it?" "It has been in the family a very long while," returned Monte Cristo, "a sort of treasure expressly forbidden to be touched for a certain period of years, during which the accumulated interest has doubled the capital. The period appointed by the testator for the disposal of these riches occurred only a short time ago, and they have only been employed by me within the last few years. Your ignorance on the subject, therefore, is easily accounted for. However, you will be better informed as to me and my possessions ere long." And the count, while pronouncing these latter words, accompanied them with one of those ghastly smiles that used to strike terror into poor Franz d'Épinay. "With your tastes and means of gratifying them," continued Danglars, "you will exhibit a splendor that must effectually put us poor miserable millionaires quite in the shade. If I mistake not, you are an admirer of paintings; at least I judge you so from the attention you appeared to be bestowing on mine when I entered the room. If you will permit me, I shall be happy to show you my picture gallery, composed entirely of works by the ancient masters, warranted as such. Not a modern picture among them. I cannot endure the modern school of painting. You are perfectly right in objecting to them, for this one great fault, that they have not yet had time to become old. Or will you allow me to show you several fine statues by Thorwaldsen, Bartoloni, and Canova, all foreign artists, for as you may perceive, I think but very indifferently of our French sculptors? You have a right to be unjust to them, monsieur. They are your compatriots. But all this may come later, when we shall be better known to each other. For the present, I will confine myself, if perfectly agreeable to you, to introducing you to the Baroness Danglars. Excuse my impatience, my dear Count, but a client like you is almost like a member of the family." Monte Cristo bowed, in sign that he accepted the proffered honour. Danglars rang, and was answered by a servant in a showy livery. "Is the Baroness at home?" inquired Danglars. "Yes, my lord," answered the man. "And alone?" "No, my lord, Madame has visitors." "Have you any objection to meet any persons who may be with Madame, or do you desire to preserve a strict incognito?" "No, indeed," replied Monte Cristo with a smile. "I do not arrogate to myself the right of so doing." "And who is with Madame, Monsieur Debray?" inquired Danglars, with an air of indulgence and good nature that made Monte Cristo smile, acquainted as he was with the secrets of the banker's domestic life. "Yes, my lord," replied the servant, "Monsieur Debray is with Madame." Danglars nodded his head, then turning to Monte Cristo said, "Monsieur Lucien Debray is an old friend of ours, and private secretary to the Minister of the Interior. As for my wife, I must tell you, she lowered herself by marrying me, for she belongs to one of the most ancient families in France. Her maiden name was de Sèvres, and her first husband was Colonel the Marquis of Narbonne. I have not the honor of knowing Madame Danglars, but I have already met Monsieur Lucien Debray." "Ah, indeed," said Danglars. "Where was that?" "At the house of Monsieur de Morcerf." "Aha, you are acquainted with the young viscount, are you?" "We were together a good deal during the carnival at Rome." "True, true," cried Danglars. "Let me see, have I not heard talk of some strange adventure with bandits or thieves hid in ruins, and of his having had a miraculous escape? I forget how, but I know he used to amuse my wife and daughter by telling them about it after his return from Italy." "Her ladyship is waiting to receive you, gentlemen," said the servant, who had gone to inquire the pleasure of his mistress. "With your permission," said Danglars, bowing, "I will precede you to show you the way." "By all means," replied Monte Cristo. "I follow you." Chapter 46.
Chapter 47 of The Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 47. The Dappled Greys. The baron, followed by the count, traversed a long series of apartments, in which the prevailing characteristics were heavy magnificence and the gaudiness of ostentatious wealth, until he reached the boudoir of Madame Danglars, a small octagonal-shaped room hung with pink satin, covered with white Indian muslin. The chairs were of ancient workmanship and materials. Over the doors were painted sketches of shepherds and shepherdesses, after the style and manner of Boucher, and at each side pretty medallions in crayons, harmonizing well with the furnishings of this charming apartment, the only one throughout the great mansion in which any distinctive taste prevailed. The truth was, it had been entirely overlooked in the plan arranged and followed out by M. Danglars and his architect, who had been selected to aid the baron in the great work of improvement solely because he was the most fashionable and celebrated decorator of the day. The decorations of the boudoir had then been left entirely to Madame Danglars and Lucien Debray. M. Danglars, however, while possessing a great admiration for the antique, as it was understood during the time of the Directory, entertained the most sovereign contempt for the simple elegance of his wife's favorite sitting-room, where, by the way, he was never permitted to intrude, unless, indeed, he excused his own appearance by ushering in some more agreeable visitor than himself. And even then he had rather the air and manner of a person who was himself introduced than that of being the presenter of another, his reception being cordial or frigid, in proportion as the person who accompanied him chanced to please or displease the baroness. Madame Danglars, who although past the first bloom of youth was still strikingly handsome, was now seated at the piano, a most elaborate piece of cabinet and inlaid work, while Lucien Debray, standing before a small work-table, was turning over the pages of an album. Lucien had found time, preparatory to the count's arrival, to relate many particulars respecting him to Madame Danglars. It will be remembered that Monte Cristo had made a lively impression on the minds of all the party assembled at the breakfast given by Albert de Morcerf, and although Debray was not in the habit of yielding to such feelings, he had never been able to shake off the powerful influence excited in his mind by the impressive look and manner of the count. Consequently, the description given by Lucien to the baroness bore the highly colored tinge of his own heated imagination. Already excited by the wonderful stories related of the count by de Morcerf, it is no wonder that Madame Danglars easily listened to and fully credited all the additional circumstances detailed by Debray. This posing at the piano and over the album was only a little ruse adopted by way of precaution. A most gracious welcome and unusual smile were bestowed on Monsieur Danglars. The count, in return for his gentlemanly bow, received a formal though graceful curtsy, while Lucien exchanged with the count a sort of distant recognition, and with Danglars a free and easy nod. "Baroness," said Danglars, "give me leave to present to you the Count of Monte Cristo, who has been most warmly recommended to me by my correspondents at Rome. I need but mention one fact to make all the ladies in Paris court his notice, and that is, that he has come to take up his abode in Paris for a year, during which brief period he proposes to spend 6 millions of money. That means balls, dinners, and lawn parties without end, in all of which I trust the count will remember us, as he may depend upon it we shall him, in our own humble entertainments." In spite of the gross flattery and coarseness of this address, Madame Danglars could not forbear gazing with considerable interest on a man capable of expending 6 millions in 12 months, and who had selected Paris for the scene of his princely extravagance. "And when did you arrive here?" inquired she. "Yesterday morning, madame." "Coming, as usual, I presume, from the extreme end of the globe? Pardon me, at least, such as I have heard is your custom." "Nay, madame, this time I have merely come from Cadiz." "You have selected a most unfavorable moment for your first visit. Paris is a horrible place in summer. Balls, parties, and fêtes are over. The Italian opera is in London, the French opera everywhere except in Paris. As for the Théâtre François, you know, of course, that it is nowhere. The only amusements left us are the indifferent races at the Champ de Mars and Château. Do you propose entering any horses at either of these races, count?" "I shall do whatever they do at Paris, madame, if I have the good fortune to find someone who will initiate me into the prevalent ideas of amusement." "Are you fond of horses, count?" "I have passed a considerable part of my life in the East, madame, and you are doubtless aware that the Orientals value only 2 things, the fine breeding of their horses and the beauty of their women." "Nay, count," said the baroness, "it would have been somewhat more gallant to have placed the ladies first." "You see, madame, how rightly I spoke when I said I required a preceptor to guide me in all my sayings and doings here." At this instant the favorite attendant of Madame Danglars entered the boudoir. Approaching her mistress, she spoke some words in an undertone. Madame Danglars turned very pale, then exclaimed, "I cannot believe it! The thing is impossible!" "I assure you, madame," replied the woman, "it is as I have said." Turning impatiently towards her husband, Madame Danglars demanded, "Is this true?" "Is what true, madame?" inquired Danglars, visibly agitated. "What my maid tells me." "But what does she tell you?" "That when my coachman was about to harness the horses to my carriage, he discovered that they had been removed from the stables without his knowledge. I desire to know what is the meaning of this." "Be kind enough, madame, to listen to me," said Danglars. "Oh, yes, I will listen, monsieur, for I am most curious to hear what explanation you will give. These 2 gentlemen shall decide between us. But first, I will state the case to them. Gentlemen, continued the Baroness, among the 10 horses in the stables of Baron Danglars are 2 that belong exclusively to me, a pair of the handsomest and most spirited creatures to be found in Paris. But to you, at least, Monsieur Debray, I need not give a further description, because to you my beautiful pair of dappled greys were well known. Well, I had promised Madame de Villefort the loan of my carriage to drive tomorrow to the Bois, but when my coachman goes to fetch the greys from the stables, they are gone, positively gone. No doubt Monsieur Danglars has sacrificed them to the selfish consideration of gaining some thousands of paltry francs. Oh, what a detestable crew they are, these mercenary speculators!" "Madame," replied Danglars, "the horses were not sufficiently quiet for you. They were scarcely 4 years old, and they made me extremely uneasy on your account." "Nonsense!" retorted the Baroness. "You could not have entertained any alarm on the subject, because you are perfectly well aware that I have had for a month in my service the very best coachman in Paris. But perhaps you have disposed of the coachman as well as the horses." "My dear love, pray do not say any more about them, and I promise you another pair exactly like them in appearance, only more quiet and steady." The Baroness shrugged her shoulders with an air of ineffable contempt, while her husband, affecting not to observe this unconjugal gesture, turned towards Monte Cristo and said, "Upon my word, count, I am quite sorry not to have met you sooner. You are setting up an establishment, of course?" "Why, yes," replied the count. "I should have liked to have made you the offer of these horses. I have almost given them away, as it is. But, as I said before, I was anxious to get rid of them upon any terms. They were only fit for a young man." "I am much obliged by your kind intentions toward me," said Monte Cristo, "but this morning I purchased a very excellent pair of carriage horses, and I do not think they were dear. There they are. Come, Monsieur Debray, you are a connoisseur, I believe. Let me have your opinion upon them." As Debray walked towards the window, Danglars approached his wife. "I could not tell you before others," said he in a low tone, "the reason of my parting with the horses, but a most enormous price was offered me this morning for them. Some madman or fool, bent upon ruining himself as fast as he can, actually sent his steward to me to purchase them at any cost. And the fact is, I have gained 16,000 francs by the sale of them. Come, don't look so angry, and you shall have 4,000 francs of the money to do what you like with, and Eugénie shall have 2,000. There, what do you think now of the affair? Wasn't I right to part with the horses?" Madame Danglars surveyed her husband with a look of withering contempt. "Great heavens!" suddenly exclaimed Debray. "What is it?" asked the Baroness. "I cannot be mistaken. These are your very horses, the very animals we were speaking of, harnessed to the count's carriage." "My dappled greys?" demanded the Baroness, springing to the window. "'Tis indeed they," said she. Danglars looked absolutely stupefied. "How very singular!" cried Monte Cristo with well-feigned astonishment. "I cannot believe it," murmured the banker. Madame Danglars whispered a few words in the ear of Debray, who approached Monte Cristo, saying, "The baroness wishes to know what you paid her husband for the horses." "I scarcely know," replied the count. "It was a little surprise prepared for me by my steward, and cost me, well, somewhere about 30,000 francs. Debray conveyed the count's reply to the baroness. Poor Danglars looked so crestfallen and discomfited that Monte Cristo assumed a pitying air towards him. "See," said the count, "how very ungrateful women are. Your kind attention in providing for the safety of the baroness by disposing of the horses does not seem to have made the least impression on her. A woman will often, from mere wilfulness, prefer that which is dangerous to that which is safe. Therefore, in my opinion, my dear baron, the best and easiest way is to leave them to their fancies, and to allow them to act as they please, and then, if any mischief follows, why, at least, they have no one to blame but themselves." Danglars made no reply. he was occupied in anticipations of the coming scene between himself and the Baroness, whose frowning brow, like that of Olympic Jove, predicted a storm. Debray, who perceived the gathering clouds and felt no desire to witness the explosion of Madame Danglars' rage, suddenly recollected an appointment, which compelled him to take his leave, while Monte Cristo, unwilling by prolonging his stay to destroy the advantages he hoped to obtain, made a farewell bow and departed, leaving Danglars to endure the angry reproaches of his wife. "Excellent!" murmured Monte Cristo to himself as he came away. "All has gone according to my wishes. The domestic peace of this family is henceforth in my hands. Now then, to play another master stroke, by which I shall gain the heart of both husband and wife. Delightful! Still," added he, "amid all this, I have not yet been presented to Mademoiselle Eugénie Danglars, whose acquaintance I should have been glad to make. But," he went on with his peculiar smile, "I am here in Paris, and have plenty of time before me. By and by will do for that." With these reflections, he entered his carriage and returned home. 2 hours afterwards, Madame Danglars received a most flattering epistle from the count, in which he entreated her to receive back her favorite dappled grays, protesting that he could not endure the idea of making his entry into the Parisian world of fashion with the knowledge that his splendid equipage had been obtained at the price of a lovely woman's regrets. The horses were sent back wearing the same harness she had seen on them in the morning, only, by the count's orders, in the center of each rosette that adorned either side of their heads had been fastened a large diamond. To Danglars, Monte Cristo also wrote, requesting him to excuse the whimsical gift of a capricious millionaire, and to beg the baroness to pardon the Eastern fashion adopted in the return of the horses. During the evening, Monte Cristo quitted Paris for Auteuil, accompanied by Ali. The following day, about 3 o'clock, a single blow struck on the gong summoned Ali to the presence of the count. "Ali," observed his master, as the Nubian entered the chamber, "you have frequently explained to me how more than commonly skillful you are in throwing the lasso, have you not?" Ali drew himself up proudly, and then returned a sign in the affirmative. "I thought I did not mistake. With your lasso could you stop an ox?" Again Ali repeated his affirmative gesture. "Or a tiger?" Ali bowed his head in token of assent. "A lion even?" Ali sprung forward, imitating the action of one throwing the lasso, then of a strangled lion. "I understand," said Monte Cristo. "You wish to tell me you have hunted the lion?" Ali smiled with triumphant pride as he signified that he had indeed both chased and captured many lions. "But do you believe you could arrest the progress of 2 horses rushing forwards with ungovernable fury?" The Nubian smiled. "It is well," said Monte Cristo. "Then listen to me. Ere long a carriage will dash past here, drawn by the pair of dappled gray horses you saw me with yesterday. Now, at the risk of your own life, you must manage to stop those horses before my door." Ali descended to the street, and marked a straight line on the pavement immediately at the entrance of the house, and then pointed out the line he had traced to the count, who was watching him. The count patted him gently on the shoulder, his usual mode of praising Ali, who, pleased and gratified with the commission assigned him, walked calmly towards a projecting stone forming the angle of the street and the house, and, seating himself thereon, began to smoke his chibouque, while Monte Cristo re-entered his dwelling, perfectly assured of the success of his plan. Still, as 5 o'clock approached, and the carriage was momentarily expected by the count, the indication of a more than common impatience and uneasiness might be observed in his manner. He stationed himself in a room commanding a view of the street, pacing the chamber with restless steps, stopping merely to listen from time to time for the sound of approaching wheels, then to cast an anxious glance on Ali. But the regularity with which the Nubian puffed forth the smoke of his chibouque proved that he at least was wholly absorbed in the enjoyment of his favorite occupation. Suddenly, a distant sound of rapidly advancing wheels was heard, and almost immediately a carriage appeared, drawn by a pair of wild, ungovernable horses, while the terrified coachman strove in vain to restrain their furious speed. In the vehicle was a young woman and a child of about 7 or 8 clasped in each other's arms. Terror seems to have deprived them even of the power of uttering a cry. The carriage creaked and rattled as it flew over the rough stones, and the slightest obstacle under the wheels would have caused disaster, but it kept on in the middle of the road, and those who saw it pass uttered cries of terror. Ali suddenly cast aside his chibouque, drew the lasso from his pocket, threw it so skillfully as to catch the forelegs of the near horse in its triple fold, and suffered himself to be dragged on for a few steps by the violence of the shock. Then the animal fell over on the pole, which snapped, and therefore prevented the other horse from pursuing its way. Gladly availing himself of this opportunity, the coachman leaped from his box, but Ali had promptly seized the nostrils of the second horse, and held them in his iron grasp, till the beast, snorting with pain, sunk beside his companion. All this was achieved in much less time than is occupied in the recital. The brief space had, however, been sufficient for a man, followed by a number of servants, to rush from the house before which the accident had occurred, and, as the coachman opened the door of the carriage, to take from it a lady who was convulsively grasping the cushions with one hand, while with the other she pressed to her bosom the young boy who had lost consciousness. Monte Cristo carried them both to the salon, and deposited them on a sofa. "Compose yourself, madame," said he. "All danger is over." The woman looked up at these words, and, with a glance far more expressive than any entreaties could have been, pointed to her child, who still continued insensible. "I understand the nature of your alarms, madame," said the count, carefully examining the child, "but I assure you there is not the slightest occasion for uneasiness. Your little charge has not received the least injury. His insensibility is merely the effects of terror, and will soon pass."
"Are you quite sure you do not say so to tranquilize my fears? See how deadly pale he is! My child, my darling Edward, speak to your mother. Open your dear eyes and look on me once again. Oh, sir, in pity send for a physician. My whole fortune shall not be thought too much for the recovery of the boy."
With a calm smile and a gentle wave of the hand, Monte Cristo signed to the distracted mother to lay aside her apprehensions. Then, opening a casket that stood near, he drew forth a phial of Bohemian glass encrusted with gold, containing a liquid of the color of blood, of which he let fall a single drop on the child's lips. Scarcely had it reached them ere the boy, though still pale as marble, opened his eyes and eagerly gazed around him. At this, the delight of the mother was almost frantic.
"Where am I?" exclaimed she, "and to whom am I indebted for such a happy termination to my late dreadful alarm?"
"Madame," answered the count, "you are under the roof of one who esteems himself most fortunate in having been able to save you from a further continuance of your sufferings."
"My wretched curiosity has brought all this about," pursued the lady. "All Paris rung with the praises of Madame Danglars' beautiful horses, and I had the folly to know whether they merited the high praise given to them."
"Is it possible," exclaimed the count, with well-feigned astonishment, "that these horses belong to the baroness?"
"They do indeed. May I inquire if you are acquainted with Madame Danglars?"
"I have that honor, and my happiness at your escape from the danger that threatened you is redoubled by the consciousness that I have been the unwilling and the unintentional cause of all the peril you have incurred. I yesterday purchased these horses of the baron, but as the baroness evidently regretted parting with them, I ventured to send them back to her, with a request that she would gratify me by accepting them from my hands."
"You are, then, doubtless, the Count of Monte Cristo, of whom Hermine has talked to me so much."
"You have rightly guessed, madame," replied the count.
"And I am Madame Héloïse de Villefort."
The count bowed with the air of a person who hears a name for the first time.
"How grateful will Monsieur de Villefort be for all your goodness! How thankfully will he acknowledge that to you alone he owes the existence of his wife and child! Most certainly, but for the prompt assistance of your intrepid servant, this dear child and myself must both have perished."
"Indeed, I still shudder at the fearful danger you were placed in."
"I trust you will allow me to recompense worthily the devotion of your man."
"I beseech you, madame," replied Monte Cristo, "not to spoil Ali. either by too great praise or rewards. I cannot allow him to acquire the habit of expecting to be recompensed for every trifling service he may render. Ali is my slave, and in saving your life he was but discharging his duty to me."
"Nay,"
interposed Madame de Villefort, on whom the authoritative style adopted by the count made a deep impression.
"Nay, but consider that to preserve my life he has risked his own."
"His life, madame, belongs not to him. It is mine, in return for my having myself saved him from death." Madame de Villefort made no further reply. Her mind was utterly absorbed in the contemplation of the person who, from the first instant she saw him, had made so powerful an impression on her. During the evident preoccupation of Madame de Villefort, Monte Cristo scrutinized the features and appearance of the boy she kept folded in her arms, lavishing on him the most tender endearments. The child was small for his age, and unnaturally pale. A mass of straight black hair, defying all attempts to train or curl it, fell over his projecting forehead, and hung down to his shoulders, giving increased vivacity to eyes already sparkling with a youthful love of mischief and fondness for every forbidden enjoyment. His mouth was large, and the lips, which had not yet regained their color, were particularly thin. In fact, the deep and crafty look, giving a predominant expression to the child's face, belonged rather to a boy of 12 or 14 than to one so young. His first movement was to free himself by a violent push from the encircling arms of his mother, and to rush forward to the casket from whence the count had taken the phial of elixir. Then, without asking permission of anyone, he proceeded, in all the wilfulness of a spoiled child unaccustomed to restrain either whims or caprices, to pull the corks out of all the bottles. "Touch nothing, my little friend," cried the count eagerly. "Some of those liquids are not only dangerous to taste, but even to inhale." Madame de Villefort became very pale, and seizing her son's arm, drew him anxiously toward her. But, once satisfied of his safety, she also cast a brief but expressive glance on the casket, which was not lost upon the count. At this moment Ali entered. At sight of him, Madame de Villefort uttered an expression of pleasure, and, holding the child still closer to her, she said,
"Edward, dearest, do you see that good man? He has shown very great courage and resolution, for he exposed his own life to stop the horses that were running away with us, and would certainly have dashed the carriage to pieces. Thank him, then, my child, in your very best manner, for, had he not come to our aid, neither you or I would have been alive to speak our thanks."
The child stuck out his lips and turned away his head in a disdainful manner, saying, "He's too ugly." The count smiled, as if the child bade fair to realize his hopes, while Madame de Villefort reprimanded her son with a gentleness and moderation very far from conveying the least idea of a fault having been committed. "This lady," said the count, speaking to Ali in the Arabic language, "is desirous that her son should thank you for saving both their lives, but the boy refuses, saying you are too ugly." Ali turned his intelligent countenance toward the boy, on whom he gazed without any apparent emotion, but the spasmodic working of the nostrils showed to the practiced eye of Monte Cristo that the Arab had been wounded to the heart.
"Will you permit me to inquire,"
said Madame de Villefort, as she rose to take her leave,
"whether you usually reside here?"
"No, I do not," replied Monte Cristo. "It is a small place I have purchased quite lately. My place of abode is number 30, Avenue des Champs-Élysées. But I see you have quite recovered from your fright, and are, no doubt, desirous of returning home. Anticipating your wishes, I have desired the same horses you came with to be put to one of my carriages, and Ali, he whom you think so very ugly," continued he, addressing the boy with a smiling air, "will have the honor of driving you home, while your coachman remains here to attend to the necessary repairs of your calash. I will have a pair of my own horses harnessed to convey it directly to Madame Danglars."
"I dare not return with those dreadful horses,"
said Madame de Villefort. "You will see," replied Monte Cristo, "that they will be as different as possible in the hands of Ali. With him they will be gentle and docile as lambs." Ali had, indeed, given proof of this, for approaching the animals, who had been got upon their legs with considerable difficulty, he rubbed their foreheads and nostrils with a sponge soaked in aromatic vinegar, and wiped off the sweat and foam that covered their mouths. Then, commencing a loud whistling noise, he rubbed them well all over their bodies for several minutes. Then, undisturbed by the noisy crowd collected round the broken carriage, Ali quietly harnessed the pacified animals to the Count's chariot, took the reins in his hands, and mounted the box, when to the utter astonishment of those who had witnessed the ungovernable spirit and maddened speed of the same horses, he was actually compelled to apply his whip in no very gentle manner before he could induce them to start, and even then all that could be obtained from the celebrated dappled greys, now changed into a couple of dull, sluggish, stupid brutes, was a slow, pottering pace, kept up with so much difficulty that Madame de Villefort was more than 2 hours returning to her residence in the Faubourg Saint-Honoré. Scarcely had the first congratulations upon her marvelous escape been gone through when she wrote the following letter to Madame Danglars. Dear Hermine, I have just had a wonderful escape from the most imminent danger, and I owe my safety to the very Count of Monte Cristo we were talking about yesterday, but whom I little expected to see today. I remember how unmercifully I laughed at what I considered your eulogistic and exaggerated praises of him, but I have now ample cause to admit that your enthusiastic description of this wonderful man fell far short of his merits. Your horses got as far as Ranelagh, when they darted forward like mad things, and galloped away at so fearful a rate, that there seemed no other prospect for myself and my poor Edward but that of being dashed to pieces against the first object that impeded their progress. When a strange-looking man, an Arab, a Negro, or a Nubian, at least a black of some nation or other, at a signal from the Count, whose domestic he is, suddenly seized and stopped the infuriated animals, even at the risk of being trampled to death himself, and certainly he must have had a most wonderful escape. The Count then hastened to us, and took us into his house, where he speedily recalled my poor Edward to life. He sent us home in his own carriage. Yours will be returned to you tomorrow. You will find your horses in bad condition from the results of this accident. They seem thoroughly stupefied, as if sulky and vexed at having been conquered by man. The Count, however, has commissioned me to assure you that 2 or 3 days' rest will bring them back to as fine, that is, as terrifying a condition as they were in yesterday. Adieu. Adieu. I cannot return you many thanks for the drive of yesterday, but, after all, I ought not to blame you for the misconduct of your horses, more especially as it procured me the pleasure of an introduction to the Count of Monte Cristo, and certainly that illustrious personage, apart from the millions he is said to be so very anxious to dispose of, seemed to me one of those curiously interesting problems I, for one, delight in solving at any risk, even if it were to necessitate another drive to the Bois behind your horses. Edward endured the accident with miraculous courage. He did not utter a single cry, but fell lifeless into my arms, nor did a tear fall from his eyes after it was over. I doubt not you will consider these praises the result of blind maternal affection, but there is a soul of iron in that delicate fragile body. Valentine sends many affectionate remembrances to your dear Eugénie. I embrace you with all my heart. Héloïse de Villefort. P.S. Do pray contrive some means for me to meet the Count of Monte Cristo at your house. I must and will see him again. I have just made M. de Villefort promise to call on him, and I hope the visit will be returned. That night the adventure at Auteuil was talked of everywhere. Albert related it to his mother, Château Renaud recounted it at the Jockey Club, and Debray detailed it at length in the salons of the minister. Even Beauchamp accorded 20 lines in his journal to the relation of the Count's courage and gallantry, thereby celebrating him as the greatest hero of the day in the eyes of all the feminine members of the aristocracy. Vast was the crowd of visitors and inquiring friends who left their names at the residence of Madame de Villefort, with the design of renewing their visit at the right moment, of hearing from her lips all the interesting circumstances of this romantic adventure. As for M. de Villefort, he fulfilled the predictions of Héloïse to the letter, donned his dress suit, ordered the servants to attend the carriage dressed in their full livery, and drove that same night to number 30 in the Avenue des Champs-Élysées. End of chapter 47. Chapter 48 of the Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 48. Ideology. If the Count of Monte Cristo had been for a long time familiar with the ways of Parisian society, he would have appreciated better the significance of the step which M. de Villefort had taken. Standing well at court, whether the king regent was of the older or younger branch, whether the government was doctrinaire liberal or conservative, looked upon by all as a man of talent, since those who have never experienced a political check are generally so regarded, hated by many, but warmly supported by others, without being really liked by anybody. M. de Villefort held a high position in the magistracy, and maintained his eminence like a harlot or a mole. His drawing-room, under the regenerating influence of a young wife and daughter by his first marriage, scarcely 18, was still one of the well-regulated Paris salons where the worship of traditional customs and the observance of rigid etiquette were carefully maintained. A freezing politeness, a strict fidelity to government principles, a profound contempt for theories and theorists, a deep-seated hatred of ideality, these were the elements of private and public life displayed by M. de Villefort. He was not only a magistrate, he was almost a diplomatist. His relations with the former court, of which he always spoke with dignity and respect, made him respected by the new one, and he knew so many things, that not only was he always carefully considered, but sometimes consulted. Perhaps this would not have been so had it been possible to get rid of M. de Villefort, but, like the feudal barons who rebelled against their sovereign, he dwelt in an impregnable fortress. This fortress was his post as king's attorney, all the advantages of which he exploited with marvelous skill, and which he would not have resigned, but to be made deputy, and thus to replace neutrality by opposition. Ordinarily, M. de Villefort made and returned very few visits. His wife visited for him, and this was the received thing in the world, where the weighty and multifarious occupations of the magistrate were accepted as an excuse for what was really only calculated pride, a manifestation of professed superiority, in fact, the application of the axiom, "Pretend to think well of yourself, and the world will think well of you," an axiom 100 times more useful in society nowadays than that of the Greeks, "Know thyself," a knowledge for which, in our days, we have substituted the less difficult and more advantageous science of knowing others. To his friends, M. de Villefort was a powerful protector. To his enemies, he was a silent but bitter opponent. For those who were neither the one nor the other, he was a statue of the law-made man. He had a haughty bearing, a look either steady and impenetrable or insolently piercing and inquisitorial. 4 successive revolutions had built and cemented the pedestal upon which his fortune was based. M. de Villefort had the reputation of being the least curious and the least wearisome man in France. He gave a ball every year, at which he appeared for a quarter of an hour only, that is to say, 45 minutes less than the king is visible at his balls. He was never seen at the theatres, at concerts, or in any place of public resort. Occasionally, but seldom, he played at whist, and then care was taken to select partners worthy of him. Sometimes they were ambassadors, sometimes archbishops, or sometimes a prince, or a president, or some dowager duchess. Such was the man whose carriage had just now stopped before the Count of Monte Cristo's door. The valet de chambre announced M. de Villefort at the moment when the count, leaning over a large table, was tracing on a map the route from St. Petersburg to China. The procureur entered with the same grave and measured step he would have employed in entering a court of justice. He was the same man, or rather the development of the same man, whom we have heretofore seen as assistant attorney at Marseilles. Nature, according to her way, had made no deviation in the path he had marked out for himself. From being slender he had now become meagre. Once pale, he was now yellow. His deep-set eyes were hollow, and the gold spectacles shielding his eyes seemed to be an integral portion of his face. He dressed entirely in black, with the exception of his white tie, and his funeral appearance was only mitigated by the slight line of red ribbon which passed almost imperceptibly through his buttonhole, and appeared like a streak of blood traced with a delicate brush. Although master of himself, Monte Cristo scrutinized with impressible curiosity the magistrate whose salute he returned, and who, distrustful by habit, and especially incredulous as to social prodigies, was much more disposed to look upon the noble stranger, as Monte Cristo was already called, as an adventurer in search of new fields, or an escaped criminal, rather than as a prince of the Holy See, or a sultan of the 1001 Nights. "Sir," said Villefort, in the squeaky tone assumed by magistrates in their oratorical periods, and of which they cannot or will not divest themselves in society, "Sir, the signal service which you yesterday rendered to my wife and son has made it a duty for me to offer you my thanks. I have come, therefore, to discharge this duty and to express to you my overwhelming gratitude." And as he said this, the eye service of the magistrate had lost nothing of its habitual arrogance. He spoke in a voice of the procureur general, with the rigid inflexibility of neck and shoulders which caused his flatterers to say, as we have before observed, that he was the living statue of the law. "Monsieur," replied the count with a chilling air, "I am very happy to have been the means of preserving a son to his mother, and they say that the sentiment of maternity is the most holy of all. And the good fortune which occurred to me, monsieur, might have enabled you to dispense with a duty which, in its discharge, confers an undoubtedly great honor, for I am aware that Monsieur de Villefort is not unusually lavish of the favor which he now bestows upon me, a favor which, however estimable, is unequal to the satisfaction which I have in my own consciousness." Villefort, astonished at this reply, which he by no means expected, started like a soldier who feels the blow leveled at him over the armor he wears, and a curl of his disdainful lip indicated that from that moment he noted in the tablets of his brain that the Count of Monte Cristo was by no means a highly bred gentleman. He glanced around, in order to seize on something on which the conversation might turn, and seemed to fall easily on a topic. He saw the map which Monte Cristo had been examining when he entered, and said, "You seem geographically engaged, sir. It is a rich study for you, who, as I learn, have seen as many lands as are delineated on this map." "Yes, sir," replied the count. "I have sought to make of the human race taken in the mass what you practice every day on individuals—a physiological study. I have believed it was much easier to descend from the whole to a part than to ascend from a part to the whole. It is an algebraic axiom which makes us proceed from a known to an unknown quantity, and not from an unknown to a known. But sit down, sir, I beg of you." Monte Cristo pointed to a chair, which the procureur was obliged to take the trouble to move forwards himself, while the count merely fell back into his own, on which he had been kneeling when M. Villefort entered. Thus the count was halfway turned towards his visitor, having his back towards the window, his elbow resting on the geographical chart which furnished the theme of conversation for the moment, a conversation which assumed, as in the case of the interviews with Danglars and Morcerf, a turn analogous to the persons, if not to the situation. "Ah, you philosophize," replied Villefort, after a moment's silence, during which, like a wrestler who encounters a powerful opponent, he took breath. "Well, sir, really, if, like you, I had nothing else to do, I should seek a more amusing occupation." "Why, in truth, sir," was Monte Cristo's reply, "man is but an ugly caterpillar for him who studies him through a solar microscope. But you said, I think, that I had nothing else to do. Now, really, let me ask you, sir, have you? Do you believe you have anything to do? Or, to speak in plain terms, do you really think that what you do deserves being called anything?" Villefort's astonishment redoubled at this second thrust so forcibly made by his strange adversary. It was a long time since the magistrate had heard a paradox so strong, or rather, to say the truth more exactly, it was the first time he had ever heard of it. The procureur exerted himself to reply. "Sir," he responded, "you are a stranger, and I believe you say yourself that a portion of your life has been spent in Oriental countries, so you are not aware how human justice, so expeditious in barbarous countries, takes with us a prudent and well-studied course." "Oh, yes, yes, I do, sir. It is the quid cluedo of the ancients. I know all that, for it is with the justice of all countries especially that I have occupied myself. It is with the criminal procedure of all nations that I have compared natural justice, and I must say, sir, that it is the law of primitive nations, that is, the law of retaliation, that I have most frequently found to be according to the law of God." "If this law were adopted, sir," said the procureur, "it would greatly simplify our legal codes, and in that case the magistrates would not, as you just observed, have much to do." "It may perhaps come to this in time," observed Monte Cristo. "You know that human inventions march from the complex to the simple, and simplicity is always perfection." "In the meanwhile," continued the magistrate, "our codes are in full force, with all their contradictory enactments derived from Gallic customs, Roman laws, and Frank usages, the knowledge of all which, you will agree, is not to be acquired without extended labor. It needs tedious study to acquire this knowledge, and, when acquired, a strong power of brain to retain it." "I agree with you entirely, sir, but all that even you know with respect to French code, I know, not only in reference to that code, but as regards the codes of all nations. The English, Turkish, Japanese, Hindu laws are as familiar to me as the French laws, and thus I was right when I said to you, that relatively—you know that everything is relative, sir—that relatively to what I have done, you have very little to do, but that relatively to all I have learned, you have a great deal to learn." "But with what motive have you learned all this?" inquired Villefort in astonishment. Monte Cristo smiled. "Really, sir," he observed, "I see that in spite of the reputation which you have acquired as a superior man, you look at everything from the material and vulgar view of society, beginning with the man and ending with the man; that is to say, in the most restricted, most narrow view which it is possible for human understanding to embrace." "Pray, sir, explain yourself," said Villefort, more and more astonished. "I really do not understand you perfectly." "I say, sir, that with the eyes fixed on the social organization of nations, you see only the springs of the machine and lose sight of the sublime workman who makes them act. I say that you do not recognize before you and around you any but those office holders whose commissions have been signed by a minister or king, and that the men whom God has put above those officers, ministers, and kings, by giving them a mission to follow out, instead of a post to fill, I say that they escape your narrow, limited field of observation. It is thus that human weakness fails, from its debilitated and imperfect organs. Tobias took the angel who restored him to light for an ordinary young man. The nations took Attila, who was doomed to destroy them, for a conqueror similar to other conquerors, and it was necessary for both to reveal their missions, that they might be known and acknowledged. One was compelled to say, 'I am the angel of the Lord,' and the other, 'I am the hammer of God,' in order that the divine essence in both might be revealed." "Then," said Villefort, more and more amazed, and really supposing he was speaking to a mystic or a madman, "you consider yourself as one of these extraordinary beings whom you have mentioned?" "And why not?" said Monte Cristo coldly. "Your pardon, sir," replied Villefort, quite astounded, "but you will excuse me if, when I presented myself to you, I was unaware that I should meet with a person whose knowledge and understanding so far passes the usual knowledge and understanding of men. It is not usual with us corrupted wretches of civilization to find gentlemen like yourself, possessors, as you are, of immense fortune at least, so it is said. And I beg you to observe that I do not inquire, I merely repeat. It is not usual, I say, for such privileged and wealthy beings to waste their time in speculations on the state of society, in philosophical reveries, intended at best to console those whom fate has disinherited from the goods of this world." "Really, sir," retorted the count, "have you attained the eminent situation in which you are, without having admitted, or even without having met with exceptions? And do you never use your eyes, which must have acquired so much finesse and certainty, to divine at a glance the kind of man by whom you are confronted? Should not a magistrate be not merely the best administrator of the law, but the most crafty expounder of the chicanery of his profession? A steel probe to search hearts? A touchstone to try the gold which in each soul is mingled with more or less of alloy?" "Sir," said Villefort, "upon my word, you overcome me. I really never heard a person speak as you do." "Because you remain entirely encircled in a round of general conditions, and have never dared to raise your wings into those upper spheres which God hath peopled with invisible or exceptional beings." And you allow then, sir, that spheres exist, and that these marked and invisible beings mingle among us? Why should they not? Can you see the air you breathe, and yet without which you could not for a moment exist? Then we do not see those beings to whom you allude? Yes, we do. We see them whenever God pleases to allow them to assume a material form. You touch them, come in contact with them, speak to them, and they reply to you. Ah, said Villefort, smiling, I confess I should like to be warned when one of these beings is in contact with me. You have been served as you desire, monsieur, for you were warned just now, and I now again warn you. Then you yourself are one of these marked beings? Yes, monsieur, I believe so, for until now no man has found himself in a position similar to mine. The dominions of kings are limited either by mountains or rivers, or change of manners, or an alteration of language. My kingdom is bounded only by the world, for I am not an Italian, or a Frenchman, or a Hindu, or an American, or a Spaniard. I am a cosmopolite. No country can say it saw my birth. God alone knows what country will see me die. I adopt all customs, speak all languages. You believe me to be a Frenchman, for I speak French with the same facility and purity as yourself. Well, Ali, my Nubian, believes me to be an Arab. Bertuccio, my steward, takes me for a Roman. Haydée, my slave, thinks me a Greek. You may therefore comprehend that being of no country, asking no protection from any government, acknowledging no man as my brother, not one of the scruples that arrest the powerful, or the obstacles which paralyze the weak, paralyze or arrests me. I have only two adversaries. I will not say two conquerors, for with perseverance I subdue even them. They are time and distance. There is a third, and the most terrible, that is my condition as a mortal being. This alone can stop me in my onward career before I have attained the goal of which I aim, for all the rest I have reduced to mathematical terms. What men call the chances of fate, namely, ruin, change, circumstances, I have fully anticipated, and if any of these should overtake me, yet it will not overwhelm me. Unless I die, I shall always be what I am, and therefore it is that I utter the things you have never heard, even from the mouths of kings, for kings have need, and other persons have fear of you. For who is there who does not say to himself, in a society as incongruously organized as ours, perhaps some day I shall have to do with the king's attorney? But cannot you say that, sir? The moment you became an inhabitant of France, you are naturally subjected to the French law. I know it, sir, replied Monte Cristo. But when I visit a country I begin to study, by all the means which are available, the men from whom I may have anything to hope or to fear, till I know them as well as, perhaps better than, they know themselves. It follows from this that the king's attorney, be he who he may, with whom I should have to deal, would assuredly be more embarrassed than I should. That is to say, replied Villefort with hesitation, that human nature being weak, every man, according to your creed, has committed faults. Faults or crimes, responded Monte Cristo with a negligent air. You alone, amongst the men whom you do not recognize as your brothers, for you have said so, observed Villefort in a tone that faltered somewhat, you alone are perfect? No, not perfect, was the count's reply, only impenetrable, that's all. But let us leave off this strain, sir, if the tone of it is displeasing to you. I am no more disturbed by your justice than you are by my second sight. No, no, by no means, said Villefort, who was afraid of seeming to abandon his ground. No, by your brilliant and almost sublime conversation you have elevated me above the ordinary level. We no longer talk, we rise to dissertation. But you know how the theologians in their collegiate chairs, and philosophers in their controversies, occasionally say cruel truths. Let us suppose for the moment that we are theologizing in a social way, or even philosophically, and I will say to you, rude as it may seem, my brother, you sacrifice greatly to pride. You may be above others, but above you there is God. Above us all, sir, was Monte Cristo's response, in a tone and with an emphasis so deep that Villefort involuntarily shuddered. I have my pride for men, serpents always ready to threaten everyone who would pass without crushing them underfoot. But I lay aside that pride before God, who has taken me from nothing to make me what I am." "Then, Count, I admire you," said Villefort, who for the first time in this strange conversation used the aristocratic form to the unknown personage, whom, until now, he had only called Monsieur. "Yes, I say to you, if you are really strong, really superior, really pious, or impenetrable, which you are right in saying amounts to the same thing, then be proud, sir, for that is the characteristic of predominance. Yet you have unquestionably some ambition." "I have, sir." "And what may it be?" "I, too, as happens to every man once in his life, have been taken by Satan into the highest mountain in the earth, and when there he showed me all the kingdoms of the world, and as he said before, so said he to me, 'Child of earth, what wouldst thou have to make thee adore me?' I reflected long, for a gnawing ambition had long preyed upon me, and then I replied, 'Listen, I have always heard of Providence, and yet I have never seen him, or anything that resembles him, or which can make me believe that he exists. I wish to be Providence myself, for I feel that the most beautiful, noblest, most sublime thing in the world is to recompense and punish.' Satan bowed his head and groaned. 'You mistake,' he said. 'Providence does exist, only you have never seen him, because the child of God is as invisible as the parent. You have seen nothing that resembles him, because he works by secret springs, and moves by hidden ways. All I can do for you is to make you one of the agents of that providence.' The bargain was concluded. 'I may sacrifice my soul, but what matters it?' added Monte Cristo. 'If the thing were to do again, I would again do it.' Villefort looked at Monte Cristo with extreme amazement. 'Count,' he inquired, 'have you any relations?' 'No, sir, I am alone in the world.' 'So much the worse.' 'Why?' asked Monte Cristo. 'Because then you might witness a spectacle calculated to break down your pride. You say you fear nothing but death?' 'I did not say that I feared it. I only said that death alone could check the execution of my plans.' 'And old age?' 'My end will be achieved before I grow old.' 'And madness?' 'I have been nearly mad, and you know the axiom, non bis in idem. It is an axiom of criminal law, and consequently you understand its full application.' 'Sir,' continued Villefort, 'there is something to fear besides death, old age, and madness. For instance, there is apoplexy, that lightning stroke which strikes but does not destroy you, and yet which brings everything to an end. You are still yourself as now, and yet you are yourself no longer. You, who, like Ariel, verge on the angelic, are but an inert mass, which, like Caliban, verges on the brutal, and this is called, in human tongues, as I tell you, neither more nor less than apoplexy. Come, if so you will, count, and continue this conversation at my house. Any day you may be willing to see an adversary capable of understanding and anxious to refute you, and I will show you my father, Monsieur Noirtier de Villefort, one of the most fiery Jacobins of the French Revolution. That is to say, he had the most remarkable audacity, seconded by a most powerful organization, a man who has not, perhaps, like yourself, seen all the kingdoms of the earth, but who has helped to overturn one of the greatest. In fact, a man who believed himself, like you, one of the envoys, not of God, but of a supreme being, not of Providence, but of fate. Well, sir, the rupture of a blood vessel on the lobe of the brain has destroyed all this, not in a day, not in an hour, but in a second. Monsieur Noirtier, who on the previous night was the old Jacobin, the old senator, the old Carburano, laughing in the guillotine, the cannon, and the dagger, Monsieur Noirtier, playing with the revolutions, Monsieur Noirtier, for whom France was a vast chessboard, from whom pawns, rooks, knights, and queens were to disappear, so that the king was checkmated, Monsieur Noirtier, the redoubtable, was the next morning. Poor Monsieur Noirtier, the helpless old man, at the tender mercies of the weakest creature in the household, that is, his grandchild, Valentine. A dumb and frozen carcass, in fact, living painlessly on, that time may be given for his frame to decompose without his consciousness of its decay. "Alas, sir," said Monte Cristo, "this spectacle is neither strange to my eye nor my thought. I am something of a physician, and have, like my fellows, sought more than once for the soul in living and in dead matter. Yet, like Providence, it has remained invisible to my eyes, although present to my heart. 100 writers since Socrates, Seneca, St. Augustine, and Gall have made in verse and prose the comparison you have made, and yet I can well understand that a father's sufferings may effect great changes in the mind of a son. I will call on you, sir, since you bid me contemplate, for the advantage of my pride, this terrible spectacle, which must have been so great a source of sorrow in your family. It would have been so, unquestionably, had not God given me so large a compensation. In contrast with the old man who is dragging his way to the tomb, are 2 children just entering into life, Valentine, the daughter of my first wife, Mademoiselle Renée Saint Méran, and Edward, the boy whose life you have this day saved. And what is your deduction from this compensation, sir?" inquired Monte Cristo. "My deduction is," replied Villefort, "that my father, led away by his passions, has committed some fault unknown to human justice, but marked by the justice of God. That God, desirous in his mercy to punish but one person, has visited this justice on him alone." Monte Cristo, with a smile on his lips, uttered in the depths of his soul a groan which would have made Villefort fly had he but heard it. "Adieu, sir," said the magistrate, who had risen from his seat. "I leave you, bearing a remembrance of you, a remembrance of esteem, which I hope will not be disagreeable to you when you know me better, for I am not a man to bore my friends, as you will learn. Besides, you have made an eternal friend of Madame de Villefort." The count bowed, and contented himself with seeing Villefort to the door of his cabinet, the procureur being escorted to his carriage by 2 footmen, who, on a signal from their master, followed him with every mark of attention. When he had gone, Monte Cristo breathed a profound sigh, and said, "Enough of this poison, let me now seek the antidote." Then sounding his bell, he said to Ali, who entered, "I am going to Madame's chamber. Have the carriage ready at 1 o'clock." Chapter 48.
Chapter 49 of The Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 49. Haydée. It will be recollected that the new, or rather old, acquaintances of the Count of Monte Cristo, residing in the Rue Meslay, were no other than Maximilian, Julie, and Emmanuel. The very anticipations of delight to be enjoyed in his forthcoming visits, the bright, pure gleam of heavenly happiness it diffused over the almost deadly warfare in which he had voluntarily engaged, illuminated his whole countenance with a look of ineffable joy and calmness, as immediately after Villefort's departure, his thoughts flew back to the cheering prospect before him, of tasting, at least, a brief respite from the fierce and stormy passions of his mind. Even Ali, who had hastened to obey the count's summons, went forth from his master's presence in charmed amazement at the unusual animation and pleasure depicted on features ordinarily so stern and cold, while, as though dreading to put to flight the agreeable ideas hovering over his patron's meditations, whatever they were, the faithful Nubian walked on tiptoe towards the door, holding his breath, lest its faintest sound should dissipate his master's happy reverie. It was noon, and Monte Cristo had set apart 1 hour to be passed in the apartments of Haydée, as though his oppressed spirit could not all at once admit the feeling of pure and unmixed joy, but required a gradual succession of calm and gentle emotions to prepare his mind to receive full and perfect happiness, in the same manner as ordinary natures demand to be inured by degrees by the reception of strong or violent sensations. The young Greek, as we have already said, occupied a apartment wholly unconnected with those of the count. The rooms had been fitted up in strict accordance with the Oriental ideas. The floors were covered with the richest carpets Turkey could produce. The walls hung with brocaded silk of the most magnificent designs and texture, while around each chamber luxurious divans were placed, with piles of soft and yielding cushions, that needed only to be arranged at the pleasure or convenience of such as sought repose. Haydée and 3 French maids, and one who was a Greek. The first 3 remained constantly in a small waiting-room, ready to obey the summons of a small golden bell, or to receive the orders of the Romaic slave, who knew just enough French to be able to transmit her mistress's wishes to the 3 other waiting-women. The latter had received most peremptory instructions from Monte Cristo to treat Haydée with all the deference they would observe to a queen. The young girl herself generally passed her time in the chamber at the farther end of her apartments. This was a sort of boudoir, circular, and lighted only from the roof, which consisted of rose-coloured glass. Haydée was reclining upon soft downy cushions, covered with blue satin spotted with silver. Her head, supported by one of her exquisitely moulded arms, rested on the divan immediately behind her, while the other was employed in adjusting to her lips the coral tube of a rich narghile, through whose flexible pipe she drew the smoke fragrant by its passage through perfumed water. Her attitude, though perfectly natural for an Eastern woman, would, in a European, have been deemed too full of coquettish straining after effect. Her dress, which was that of the woman of Epirus, consisted of a pair of white satin trousers, embroidered with pink roses, displaying feet so exquisitely formed and so delicately fair that they might well have been taken for Parian marble, had not the eye been undeceived by their movements as they constantly shifted in and out of a pair of little slippers with upturned toes, beautifully ornamented with gold and pearls. She wore a blue and white striped vest, with long open sleeves, trimmed with silver loops and buttons of pearls, and a sort of bodice, which, closing only from the centre to the waist, exhibited the whole of the ivory throat and upper part of the bosom. It was fastened with 3 magnificent diamond clasps. The junction of the bodice and the drawers was entirely concealed by one of the many-coloured scarfs, whose brilliant hues and rich silken fringe have rendered them so precious in the eyes of Parisian belles. Tilted on one side of her head she had a small cap of gold-coloured silk, embroidered with pearls, while on the other a purple rose mingled its glowing colours with the luxuriant masses of her hair, of which the blackness was so intense that it was tinged with blue. The extreme beauty of the countenance, that shone forth in loveliness that mocked the vain attempts of dress to augment it, was peculiarly and purely Grecian. There were the large, dark, melting eyes, the finely formed nose, the coral lips, and pearly teeth, that belonged to her race and country. And, to complete the whole, Haydée was in the very springtide and fullness of youthful charms. She had not yet numbered more than 20 summers. Monte Cristo summoned the Greek attendant, and bade her inquire whether it would be agreeable to her mistress to receive his visit. Haydée's only reply was to direct her servant by a sign to withdraw the tapestried curtain that hung before the door of her boudoir, the framework of the opening thus made serving as a sort of border to the graceful tableau presented by the young girl's picturesque attitude and appearance. As Monte Cristo approached, she leaned upon the elbow of the arm that held the narghile, and extending to him her other hand, said, with a smile of captivating sweetness, in the sonorous language spoken by the women of Athens and Sparta: "Why demand permission ere you enter? Are you no longer my master, or have I ceased to be your slave?" Monte Cristo returned her smile. "Haydée," said he, "you well know." "Why do you address me so coldly, so distant?" asked the young Greek. "Have I by any means displeased you? Oh, if so, punish me as you will, but do not speak to me in tones and manner so formal and constrained." "Haydée," replied the count, "you know that you are now in France, and are free." "Free to do what?" asked the young girl. "Free to leave me." "Leave you? Why should I leave you?" "That is not for me to say, but we are now about to mix in society, to visit and be visited." I don't wish to see anybody but you." "And should you see one whom you could prefer, I would not be so unjust." "I have never seen anyone I preferred to you, and I have never loved anyone but you and my father." "My poor child," replied Monte Cristo, "that is merely because your father and myself are the only men who have ever talked to you." "I don't want anybody else to talk to me. My father said I was his joy. You style me your love, and both of you called me my child." "Do you remember your father, Haydée?" The young Greek smiled. "He is here, and here," said she, touching her eyes and her heart. "And where am I?" inquired Monte Cristo laughingly. "You!" cried she, with tones of thrilling tenderness. "You are everywhere." Monte Cristo took the delicate hand of the young girl in his, and was about to raise it to his lips, when the simple child of nature hastily withdrew it, and presented her cheek. "You now understand, Haydée," said the count, "that from this moment you are absolutely free; that here you exercise unlimited sway, and are at liberty to lay aside or continue the custom of your country, as it may suit your inclination. Within this mansion you are absolute mistress of your action, and may go abroad or remain in your apartments as may seem most agreeable to you. A carriage waits your orders, and Ali and Myrtho will accompany you whithersoever you desire to go. There is but one favour I would entreat of you." "Speak." "Guard carefully the secret of your birth. Make no allusion to the past, nor upon any occasion be induced to pronounce the names of your illustrious father or ill-fated mother." "I have already told you, my lord, that I shall see no one." "It is possible, Haydée, that so perfect a seclusion, though conformable with the habits and customs of the East, may not be practicable in Paris. Endeavour, then, to accustom yourselves to our manner of living in these northern climes, as you did in those of Rome, Florence, Milan, and Madrid. It may be useful to you one of these days, whether you remain here or return to the East." The young girl raised her tearful eyes towards Monte Cristo as she said with touching earnestness, "Whether we return to the East, you mean to say, my lord, do you not?" "My child," returned Monte Cristo, "you know full well that whenever we part, it will be no fault or wish of mine. The tree forsakes not the flower falls from the tree." "My lord," replied Haydée, "I never will leave you, for I am sure I could not exist without you." "My poor girl, in 10 years I shall be old, and you will be still young." "My father had a long white beard, but I loved him. He was 60 years old, but to me he was handsomer than all the fine youths I saw." "Then tell me, Haydée, do you believe you shall be able to accustom yourself to our present mode of life?" "Shall I see you?" "Every day." "Then what do you fear, my lord?" "You might find it dull." "No, my lord, in the morning I shall rejoice in the prospect of your coming, and in the evening dwell with delight on the happiness I have enjoyed in your presence. Then too, when alone, I can call forth mighty pictures of the past, see vast horizons bounded only by the towering mountains of Pindus and Olympus. Oh, believe me, that when 3 great passions, such as sorrow, love, and gratitude, fill the heart, ennui can find no place." "You are a worthy daughter of Epirus, Haydée, and your charming and poetical ideas prove well your descent from that race of goddesses who claim your country as their birthplace. Depend on my care to see that your youth is not blighted, or suffered to pass away in ungenial solitude; and of this be well assured, that if you love me as a father, I love you as a child." "You are wrong, my lord. The love I have for you is very different from the love I had for my father. My father died, but I did not die. If you were to die, I should die too." The count, with a smile of profound tenderness, extended his hand, and she carried it to her lips. Monte Cristo, thus attuned to the interview he proposed to hold with Morrel and his family, departed, murmuring as he went these lines of Pindar: "Youth is the flower, which love is the fruit. Happy is he who, after having watched its silent growth, is permitted to gather and call it his own. The carriage was prepared according to orders, and stepping lightly into it, the count drove off at his usual rapid pace. Chapter 49.